Good morning. Welcome to the Sunday Morning Forum at the First Unitarian Society in Milwaukee. Before we begin this morning, I'd like to remind you that next Sunday, November 27th, our speaker will be Tom Lutke. He's the retired executive director of the Museum of Wisconsin Arts. A creative place of Wisconsin art history is the title. And a quick reminder that we are in an optional mask period here at the programs, and while also honoring the COVID safety needs of those who are present. And now I welcome today's host, Jerry Frederickson, who will introduce our speaker.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to the Sunday Morning Forum. It does seem to be a little warmer up here than it did in the sanctuary, so that's a good thing because we're really freezing down there in the streets. So anyway, it's really great to have Matt here. We've had a number of wonderful speakers from Madison come in the past, and we recycled them like Mike McCabe and Ed Garvey. Boy, he was something to have him here, and Jay Heck. And all these years we never invited Rothschild. I can't figure out why we didn't do that, because he's one of those stars in medicine and we'd like to have her. So we finally got him here. And Matt has been one of those people who has worked most of his life for reforming government, and you're probably going to hear a little bit about gerrymandering and money in politics today. And a little bit about, we did have an election recently, so maybe we're going to be talking about that. So without any further, please welcome Matt Rothschild.
Thank you, Jerry. And thanks for inviting me, and thanks for those nice words. And thanks everyone for being here. It's a pleasure to speak in person in Milwaukee again. My last talk in Milwaukee was on March 10th, 2020. And everything shut down the day after. I remember the date because it's my wife's birthday. And I came down here to give a talk. And when we got back to Madison, the word was out that everything was shut down. So it's a pleasure to be here. And thanks for coming out in this prematurely cold November morning. So I want to talk a little bit about the elections, a little bit about the anti-democracy movement that we've been facing and that we're still facing. And then I want to give a few hints of hope. So the elections, I woke up on Tuesday, November 8th, and I thought we were in a car racing down, basically. And by the end of the day, or by the next morning, I realized that the car had turned off at the last exit before hell, and then stopped at a gas station and decided that maybe it's not such a good idea. Maybe we should turn around a little bit. So I think that's where we are as a country and as a state. I was pleased and relieved, I should say, procedurally, that the democracy functioned as it's supposed to during an elections by and large, which is to say, there wasn't a lot of hassling at the polls. The election workers and the poll workers weren't under tremendous threats of violence. There wasn't much violence to speak of here or around the country. The losers, with the exception of Kerry Lake and maybe Mary Loudenbeck, decided to concede when it was obvious that they had lost. That's a plus, big plus from what happened in November 2020. So procedurally, it went well. And that was a tremendous relief, because a lot of us were worried, and a lot of us had done some planning, and a lot of poll workers had done, and clerks had done some planning for worst case scenarios. And then some of the issues that came to the fore, I was delighted to see that the issue of a woman's reproductive rights really galvanized people, especially young women, to come out and vote in really big numbers. And I was also pleased that the issue of democracy took hold, and it was interesting for me to see, because I was in a lot of Zooms with some of the best messaging people in the country and some of the best pollsters in the country for weeks and weeks before the election, and they kept telling me much to my chagrin, because I'm at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign and I campaign for democracy 9 to 5, 5 days a week. That they were saying, you know, democracy is, we all agree, it's a great issue, it's really important, you gotta defend it, but it's not a sell. It's not a good selling issue. It's not an issue that's going to bring people out or going to convince people who don't already agree with you. But it turns out democracy was a pretty good sell on November 8th. And a lot of people came out. I saw one statistic that 44% of the people who showed up to vote on November 8th across the country came out because they were worried about our democracy. That was their number one issue. So that is also a relief to me. As far as the outcome here in Wisconsin, on a personal level, I want to say I was relieved that Governor Evers won. I think he's been a pretty good governor. He's protected our public schools. He's protected our voting rights and some really nasty bills that the Republicans passed in the legislature. He stood up for teaching American history without putting a gloss on it. And he's defended our environment. He's been a pretty good governor. He's a bad candidate, though. Can I say frankly, he's a horrible candidate. I mean, he's not a political athlete, this guy. He's not a good public speaker. And he's a horrible debater. I don't know if anyone here watched the debate. I didn't watch it. I listened to it. We were up at Kohler Andre State Park with a couple of friends of ours. Then we stopped at one of those good Italian restaurants in Sheboygan, and then we were driving back, listening to it on radio, and we just got angrier and angrier because he was not performing well. And maybe he hadn't prepared well. But maybe we should get used to or accept the fact that you don't have to be a great performer to be a good politician or a good governor. And certainly he's not a good performer, but he is a good governor. And as he said in his acceptance speech, his victory speech, maybe boring is what people want. And it is refreshing that, you know, he is who he is, and he doesn't pretend to be anybody else. You know, he's a decent person who was a science teacher and was a principal and superintendent and didn't pretend to be anything other than kind of a boring science teacher, frankly. So I'm glad he's there. As far as the Senate race goes, I give Mandela Barnes credit. I give him credit for doing better than Russ Feingold did twice. I give him credit for running a dignified campaign when he was hit with, and let's be blunt here, some of the most disgusting, disreputable, and racist ads I've ever seen in Wisconsin. These ads were paid for, some by Ron Johnson himself, by his own campaign, and also some of those were paid for by an outside group that was funded and founded by Diane Hendricks and Richard Eline, two of the richest people in this area. And their ads were just absolutely horrifyingly racist. And the fact that that still works in Wisconsin is a real problem for all of us that we have to address. That still you can take down a decent person like Mandela Barnes just by painting him as different and dangerous. That was what they said about him, different and dangerous. It wasn't really a dog whistle at all. It was a megaphone of racism. But, you know, Mandela Barnes fought back. He fought back in his debates. I watched both of his debates. I thought he beat the living daylights out of Ron Johnson in those debates. And he came on strong at the end when President Obama was here in Milwaukee 10 days before the election. I didn't get a chance to see him. I was still in Madison, but I heard his speech, and he gave a great speech. And I kind of wish Mandela Barnes had used snippets of that speech, especially the attack on Ron Johnson for going after Social Security.
Yeah.
It was 1 minute of the most powerful political rhetoric that ever wanted. Barack Obama is a great political athlete. So Mandela Barnes's ads, I frankly didn't like. I mean, I didn't like the peanut butter and jelly ad. I didn't like the ad where he was at a cafeteria and saying this is the same old slop, and then he's going to go somewhere else and got pizzas and delivered pizzas to kids in the classroom. I couldn't understand that ad for one thing. And for another, you know, these ads, including the shopping in the grocery store with the jug of milk, I wanted him to go after Ron Johnson, or at least to say Ron Johnson is going to take away your Social Security. I'm going to keep it. Ron Johnson's going to ship your jobs overseas. I'm going to keep them. Whatever. Give us three strong reasons instead of the cutesy. You know, I'm a nice guy ad, and my dad worked third shift. I didn't need to hear that one more time, really. But you know, it's easy to be a Sunday morning quarterback or a Wednesday morning quarterback, and it's hard to run when those hideous ads are being thrown at you. So I think he's got nothing to be ashamed of. He ran a very progressive campaign. When was the last time you heard of a candidate running for office in Wisconsin who talked as much about unions as Mandela Barnes did? So I give him a lot of credit for that. I do want to talk about this anti-democracy movement that we've been facing for the last 5 or 6 years, what it consists of, and how to counter it. And it's still with us, even though I don't think the anti-democracy forces gained ground on November 8th. They might have lost a little ground. But what does this anti-democracy movement consist of? We got to figure that out in order to beat it. And the first thing it consists of, most obviously, is this Trump cult. I mean, there still are, hard to believe, but there still are tens of millions of Americans who think Donald Trump is the greatest thing since the SOS had. And, you know, and some people actually believe he was put on the face of the earth by God himself, as odd and crazy and foolish as that is. So this Trump cult is a big part of the problem. But the second group, and you know, these are overlapping groups, are what I call the irrationalists. There's so much irrationality in our political atmosphere these days that it's hard to have a functioning democracy at that level. And by irrationality, I mean not just those who think Trump was put on earth by God himself, but people who are deniers about the November 2020 election. I mean, these are people, and it's not just Trump himself. You know, there are about, you know, there are dozens who were elected to the House of Representatives who are deniers about what happened on November 2020. You know, these are people, these are like the parents of the spoiled kids who were playing basketball and football and they didn't like the referee's call. They're arguing in the parking lot with the referee 2 years after the game's over. I mean, that's how crazy it is. So there's the election deniers, there's the climate deniers, there's the COVID deniers. And then there's QAnon, which is a really crazy, irrational cult of its own. And they believe that, you know, liberals and Democrats are drinking the blood of babies. I mean, this is literally what they believe. And it is just the reserving of an old anti-Semitic trope from the protocols of the elders of Zion. The Jews are drinking the blood of babies. And that's where that comes from. And that's the echo that they want to have. So you have the Trump cult, you have the irrationalists, and then the white nationalists. Let's look at white nationalism, or sometimes what's called white Christian nationalism. I talked about the racism in the ads, but we have white nationalists. We have armed racist men and a few women in camouflage out with their guns in the streets of this country. Some of them are flying Confederate flags. Some are there with Nazi paraphernalia. And when the media describes the white nationalists, it does a disservice largely because they talk about the Proud Boys. They'll talk about the Oath Keepers, but they're not really telling us what the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers believe. And so you can think, well, these are guys out with their guns and camouflage, big deal. We see that all the time. In Wisconsin, you know, people are wearing camouflage and carry their guns, no big deal. It is a big deal. It's a big deal because the Proud Boys are wearing shirts that say Pinochet did nothing wrong. Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet, the dictator in Chile, whose forces overthrew democratically elected Salvador Allende president, and then proceeded to kill thousands of people and torture tens of thousands more. They were throwing people out of planes into the ocean. And to say Pinochet did nothing wrong is an atrocity, a verbal atrocity. The Proud Boys are also wearing shirts that have the initials that signify 6 million wasn't enough. That Adolf Hitler didn't murder enough Jews in the Holocaust. They might think it's funny. I don't think it's funny. I know you don't think it's funny either. But that is who these folks are. They don't believe in democracy. They glorify violence. They glorify violence against minorities. And also, I want to focus for a second on the nationalism part of white nationalists. Nationalism is a very toxic chemical in the chemical chart. It can, you know, patriotism is okay, but it can transform itself into nationalism. Nationalism is a scary force. Any reckoning with what happened in the 20th century has to deal with the fact that nationalism can lead to mass murder. And we heard in Trump's speech when he announced we're president again, What was he talking about? First of all, from last time around, Make America Great Again, what is that except an appeal to a beleaguered sense of patriotism and an infringed upon nationalism? And he one-upped himself when he announced again by talking about the lost glory of the United States, that he was going to restore the lost glory. So it's now Make America Great Again and glorious again. This appeal to a bereaved nationalism is an appeal that fascists have used throughout the last 100 years. This was Mussolini's pitch. This was Hitler's pitch. This was Franco's pitch. And going back to Pinochet, I was in Santiago once, and I highly recommend you going if you're ever there. The Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Santiago, an incredible museum, where you go into the first floor and you see depictions of what happened during the coup. And then there's an audio actually of Pinochet's speech he gave on the night of the coup, which I believe was September 11th. And he said on the night of the coup, we talked about God and family and country. That was his big pitch, restoring the past glory of Chile. So we've got to be careful with nationalism. And its appeal that resonates with so many Americans who, they want to be patriotic. They are patriotic. I understand patriotism, but this idea that we're this greatest country on earth and that we need to, crush other people because we're so great is something we need to watch out for ourselves and with our neighbors and friends. So there's the Trump cult, there's irrationalism, there's white nationalism, and then there's the leadership of the Republican Party that has been apologists for what happened on January 6th. I mean, how else do you interpret the term that the head of the RNC gave to January 6th? Legitimate political discourse. That's what they call January 6th. There's nothing legitimate about storming the Capitol, trashing the Capitol, and wounding 150 police officers with American flags, using the spear on the American flag as a weapon, and using other weapons that they had there. There's nothing legitimate about that. And this apology that we keep hearing from Ron Johnson and from others, from Derek Van Orden, who was there on January 6th, that January 6th was just legitimate political protest. Those are three of the most obscene words I've ever heard in context of politics. So there's that. And the last constituent element of this anti-democracy movement that we're facing is this right-wing media infrastructure that feeds millions and millions of people toxic propaganda every day. And some of those folks are as if on a 24/7 IV drip of this stuff. And if that's all they're consuming, that's all they're believing. And it literally is garbage in, garbage out, and is toxic for our democracy. So that's what we're facing right now. And so how do we defeat it? I think this is something we really got to wrestle with. One, first and foremost, I fervently believe and I fervently await the need for Donald Trump to be indicted. He needs to be indicted. He should have been indicted by now. I don't know what's taking Merrick Garland so long. I hope this appointment of the special counsel will not delay things further. I was hoping Merrick Garland was going to come down with an indictment when he called that press conference rather than handing the ball over to another lawyer. I mean, all you need to do is play that tape of Trump saying, just give me 11,780 votes in Georgia, and you should be able to get a grand jury to hand down an indictment right there. That's sufficient evidence right there. And the DA in Georgia who's working on this, and I'm sure she'll come down with an indictment as well. But no one, this is accountability to, no one should be able to get away with not just stealing those documents down to Mar-a-Lago, but even worse, much more grievous, is trying to overthrow an election and interfering with the peaceful transfer of power and summoning a mob to the Capitol and, being happy when some of those followers were ready to hang the vice president of the United States, for God's sakes. I mean, it's election tampering, it's seditious conspiracy, it's interfering with the functions of government, which is to say, interfering with the functions of the Electoral College. There are a lot of crimes that this man has committed, but it's not just this man. Anyone who was participating in the planning of this seditious conspiracy should be indicted and tried. And that includes the false electors here in Wisconsin, the 10 false electors who met in the Capitol in Madison and pretended to be the actual electors for the state of Wisconsin and wanted to disfranchise more than 1,600,000 Wisconsinites who voted for Joe Biden. I mean, this was an imposter situation. And I'm hoping that Josh Hall summons the courage and indicts these folks. They shouldn't be able to get away with it either. So we need to have accountability. That's number one. Number two, I think we need to uplift the voices and honor the voices of decent Republicans who spoke up about this threat to our democracy. Most obviously, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. You know, I hate Dick Cheney with passion. I think Dick Cheney should be prosecuted for war crimes, for leading this country into war and unleash of lies, and then overseeing the policy of torture that he did while he was vice president for George W. Bush. But love me some Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney has been a real hero during this period, and she deserves to get a Medal of Freedom from Joe Biden. I hope he will give her the Medal of Freedom. That would be the honorable thing to do, and Adam Kinzinger deserves it too. Here in Wisconsin, we had another profile encouraged by another right-wing Republican. Liz Cheney is a right-wing Republican if you look at her record on foreign policy or social issues. Kathy Bernier, Senator Kathy Bernier of Chippewa Falls, has policies that I wholeheartedly disagree with, but she was very brave. She didn't run for re-election this time, so her term's just about up. She was the chair, still is for a month or two, a month and a half, of the Senate Committee on Elections here in Madison. And she said, when Gableman was conducting his circus, and when Janelle Brandtjen was talking about the fraud that happened in November 2020, she called it a circus. Stop, she said, stop with the charade. That was her exact words. Enough of the charade. Stop misleading the people of Wisconsin about what happened. And one of the reasons she spoke out is she was a clerk. She was the county clerk in Chippewa County for about a dozen years. She knows how voting works in Wisconsin. She knows how hard it is to cheat. And so she was disgusted by the attack on clerks and poll workers and just was offended by the fact that they were making stuff up. And so she spoke up loudly and clearly. She even was on CBS's 60 Minutes talking about it. And she deserves a lot of credit for being courageous on this issue. Not so the leaders of the Republican Party here in Wisconsin. Not so Robin Voss, even though he didn't go as far as Brandtjen went or Timothy Ramthun went. Those legislators wanted to decertify our elections retroactively, like a year and a half retroactively. And Voss knew better, and Voss knows in his heart that there wasn't widespread fraud, but the pressure on him from the right and from Trump made him finally cough up the lie and repeat it that in fact there was widespread fraud when there wasn't widespread fraud here in Wisconsin. Even the right-wing law firm here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty put out a report that said there wasn't widespread fraud. So we needed more courage from him. We needed more courage from Devin Lemieux, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, and we weren't getting it. We weren't getting it because they were riding a tiger. They were trying to appease their rightward flank. I mean, Voss almost lost in the primary. We all saw that. He almost lost by a handful of votes. Now that he has won, he's banished, he and his fellow Republicans have banished Janelle Brandtjen out of their caucus, which is a good thing. And she will no longer be head of the Assembly Committee on Elections. But let's not clap too hard for Robin Voss because he appointed her to be head of the Elections Commission, of the Elections Committee. He also appointed Gableman. He didn't need to appoint this right-wing, incompetent former Supreme Court justice. But he chose to, even though Gableman had said just days after the election in November 2020, that the election was stolen. So he appointed as the investigator the guy who was the accuser. Anyway, I do think it's important to uplift those who spoke out. You know, a couple former Republicans have been speaking out a lot about it. Dale Schultz, who was Senate Majority Leader from Ridgeland Center, has been very out front about this as well. Steve Gunderson too, to some extent. Reed Ribble to some extent. So there are Republicans here, and I do think we need to be careful in our rhetoric if we're progressives or Democrats, not to paint with a broad brush all Republicans or all conservatives. First of all you have to do is find, I'm an old editor, and I try to be careful with words. All you got to do is find one Republican who doesn't believe what you're asserting all Republicans believe, and you've told something that's not true. So it's good to be truthful. It's also good politically not to write off half the people who live in Wisconsin. I mean, half the people who live in Wisconsin vote Republican. And if you're not a Republican and you don't want them to vote that way, don't try to write them all out of the book of life. This is another really important thing I think we need to do if we're going to beat the anti-democracy movement. And that is, we need to convince some folks to come back from the abyss. Some people who've been tempted by the Trump rhetoric. I'm not talking about the people who are flying the Confederate flags or have Nazi swastikas tattooed on their biceps. I mean, that's not going to be a healthy conversation for you to engage in, and it might be dangerous. So you don't want to do that. And I've got a neighbor in the town of Dunn in Oregon, Wisconsin, who really right around the corner from our cul-de-sac has this ridiculous juvenile Brandon flag that he's flying, and then he has the police officer flag that's got different stripes on it, and he's just put up another flag that's half American flag and a half "Don't Tread on Me" flag. It's not going to be a good use of my time probably to talk to him. I mean, I want to. I'm vain enough to think that I could convince him, but I don't. I'm also a poker player, and I know that the odds are bad of that outcome. But I'd like to talk to him. You know, it irks me because he has 8 bird feeders out in front of his house. I'm a crazy bird watcher too, and we're all of us bird watchers are crazy to one degree or another. The fact that he loves birds and I love birds, and he doesn't see the world the way I do. He sees it opposite from the way I do, and even though Trump wanted to destroy all these wetlands in this country and didn't give a whit about a bird, I'm sure. Rankles me, and I just want to sit the guy down and have a conversation. But all I've been able to do is just talk to him twice when I saw him on the outside his house, which he has a no trespassing sign on, and just ask him what birds he had in his bird feeder. I'm just trying to establish. But anyway, what I want to stress is the importance of establishing relationships. Not so much with crazy right-wingers like that, but I want to give it a try. But really building your relationship with people who don't agree with you yet, but might, that are susceptible to rational conversation, who you already have a relationship with in a book club, an exercise club, a place of worship, a card game, a tennis game, somewhere in your social circle. You probably know people who voted in a way that you didn't like. And you may know these people as otherwise not horrible people. And I'm sure it's a bit of a puzzle to you as to why they are voting the way they are doing. I want you to find 2 people in your personal life that you know and that you want to have a conversation with, and that you want to build kind of a relationship with, and you want to bring them over if you can. Not to vote this way or that way, but just to see the dangers of this anti-democracy. It's really important for us as a civil society, for one thing, just to talk to each other. You know, there are fewer and fewer places where we can talk to each other across the ideological divide here in Wisconsin. There used to be on Wisconsin Public Radio, and Jerry mentioned Ed Garvey. Ed Garvey was a star of this. On the Friday morning talk show that Joy Gardine did every Friday from 8 to 9, where there'd be a representative of the left and a representative of the right. And I was lucky to be on once every 8 or 9 weeks. But Garvey was a pro at this. And his sense of humor was so wonderful. It was just fun to listen to. But, you know, here we would have actual debate, civil dialogue. We weren't screaming and yelling at each other. We weren't calling each other names. We weren't throwing mud at each other. We weren't stabbing each other with sticks. We were having a debate, an old-fashioned debate. And they stopped doing that on Wisconsin Public Radio. And it's beyond me why they did that. And I think that's a real loss. Also a loss is the fact that the Journal Sentinel here doesn't have a commentary page every day in their paper, or in debates in their paper in the way that they used to, pro and con debates. There used to be a really functional op-ed. There was an op-ed editor that you would deal with. And, occasionally there are op-eds in there, but there isn't the sense of the give and take and of rational conversations across our differences. And there are groups that are trying to foster this, like Better Angels, which is a really important effort. But I think on the personal level, if we could each try to put our arm around a couple people, a couple specific individuals, and try to first listen. Listening is really important. And you're not going to, first of all, convince people by calling them an idiot. And you're not going to be able to convince people by throwing a book at them and say, read this and get smarter and wake up. You need to listen to people first, where they're coming from. I'm reminded of the great organizer here in Milwaukee with Souls to the Polls, Anita Johnson. I don't know if anyone knows Anita, tremendous activist and voting rights activist. She and I and a bunch of other people were at a seminar in person. This was years before COVID. And a Washington group sent in one of their young hotshots to tell us how to knock on doors. And Anita Johnson's been knocking on doors for like 5 decades. So this very young person is giving us a talk and saying, here's how you talk. When you knock on the door, here's the script. Here's what you got to say. And I could tell that Anita was getting more and more annoyed as this young man was going on. And finally, she raised her hand and she said, we don't do that here. This is not how we knock on doors here. What we do is we knock on a door, we introduce ourselves, and we ask you a question, what's most important to you? And to me, that was a huge insight as to how you do good organizing and how you do good communications with people you actually want to bring along. And so I want to urge you, just kind of listen. I have a guy who's in my card game who is a big Trump guy, and I just tell him, I'm not good in an accusatory way. I'm just curious. What is it that you like about it? And then sit with it. Don't rebut it right away, because you can't change someone's mind by just kind of a head-on collision, either saying, no, you're wrong. I mean, people retreat. They retreat into their preconceived notions. But if you can build a relationship with people in your circle, I think we can bring enough people around in this country if we each take 2 people under our wings, that we can restore some of this civic health. And we need to restore our civic health. We've been in the ICU, so we've got to get out of there. I want to talk about hope and what gives me hope. One thing that gives me hope right now, and this is a new thing, there is a brand new progressive radio group in Wisconsin called Civic Media that is buying up radio stations all across the state to run progressive content, not from national guests so much, really local progressive content. This started with Devil's Advocates in Madison on 92.7. At first they were on IR and then they got kicked off. But Michael Prudy, as he's called, Prudy and Don do Devil's Advocate. Anyway, it was their dream to expand. And they expanded to Waukesha first. That was Prudy's doing. So there's a station in Madison, a station in Waukesha called The Shaw. And then Prude hooked up with a investor named Sage Weil, who was very active in 2020 doing voting rights work. But he recognized the importance, and God, I wish there were more of him like it, and that others had come to this conclusion decades ago, realized the need to really build a progressive media infrastructure. Because right-wing talk radio, in Milwaukee and up to the valley, right-wing talk radio has dominated this state that helped bring us Scott Walker, God forbid. And there's been virtually no response to it. And it was though that whole left-wing radio or progressive radio or pro-democracy radio was just not happening. I mean, for a while there was Air America. That was a national effort that floundered. But this is a really smart move, what they're doing. So they bought up stations in Richland Center, and it's to have real local folks do it. So the person who's doing it there is Dale Schultz's chief of staff, Todd Alba, who is running the station in Richland Center. They bought a station in Stevens Point and Rapids. They bought a station in Amory. They bought a station in Appleton. They bought a station in Wausau. And they're trying to buy other stations around the state so they can really compete with the stuff that's on right-wing radio. But also, it's not just a competition left-right. It's an effort to build civic health. That's why it's called civic media. You know, they're hyper-local. They're covering the high school football games. They have local hosts in every one of those stations. It's not like they're just bringing in, you know, Stephanie Miller's show from LA and running it nonstop, or it's not hard and nonstop. They have real local great people doing this radio gig, and so that's really important. Another thing that gives me hope, and I've been sustained by this hope for the last 7 or 8 years that I've been at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, and that is that the pro-democracy progressive nonprofit sector in Wisconsin is very united, and we're all working together, all, you know, across issues. We've torn down our silos, we've shelved our egos for the most part, and we're working together. And so we meet regularly, all of us, and, you know, let me just name some of the groups. I mean, Wisconsin Conservation Voters, ACLU, Planned Parenthood, League of Women Voters, Common Cause, Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, and we're in league with, you know, Block and LIT and the African American Roundtable and Voices to Love Frontier. And so we're all strategizing together, working together, doing media messaging together, and that's a really good thing. And I think, well, I should tell you that there are a lot of young people in these leadership positions in these progressive nonprofits who will push us forward. I mean, I've got gray hair, some of you have gray hair, and it's good to know that there are very talented people behind us. But part of being hopeful is really just a state of mind. I love the old Seamus Heaney poem, The Curate Troy, where he says, once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice rises up and hope and history rhyme. And I think it happens more than once in a lifetime. And certainly happened in 2011 when we had that spontaneous uprising at the Capitol. And he also says, believe that the further shore is reachable from here. And I do believe that further shore is reachable. And it's important, I think, to have that belief. But we're not guaranteed it. You know, I like another quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates, the great African-American writer who led the way on reparations, who says, engage in struggle not because we're guaranteed a victory. We engage in struggle because we're guaranteed of a sane and an honorable life. I mean, you know, success may not be guaranteed, certainly not around the corner. But if we are doing the work of justice, we can look ourselves in the mirror and say, you know, we might not be winning right now, but I still have my sanity and I'm not doing anything dishonest. And that's a plus in and of itself, you know. And then I remember Howard Zinn, who wrote for me at the Progressive magazine the last 12 years of his life. Howard Zinn, the author, of course, of A People's History of the United States, great radical, progressive, pro-democracy historian who's no longer with us. But he has this great line where he talks about optimism and history. And he says history is not just a chronicle of cruelty, but it's also a chronicle of compassion and sacrifice and courage and kindness. And he says if we remember those times, and that there were a lot of those times when people who were facing larger odds than we are persevered and pushed on toward victory, that gives us the possibility of giving this spinning top of a globe a chance to go in a more pro-democracy direction. And then he concludes by saying, if we act the way we want human beings to act, if we live the way we want human beings to live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, that itself is a marvelous victory. And so I say, let's live the way we want human beings to live, the way we think people ought to live. And let's defy all that's bad around us. And let's also celebrate all that's good around us. That's good around us. And then we can save our democracy here in Wisconsin, save and expand our democracy here in Wisconsin and around the country. So, thanks very much. I'm happy to take your questions.
Whatever happened to trying to do something about gerrymandering?
Well, 9 to 5,
Failure.
yeah, well, I don't think it's been a failure. We're not there yet, though. 9 to 5 at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, we work on money in politics, and we work on banning gerrymandering. And we also work on defending expanding voting rights and some other issues. But the fight against gerrymandering has taken up, a huge chunk of my time over the last 8 years. And there's been some progress on this. Let's look at the progress. When I started on this, I don't think the word gerrymandering was certainly as well known as it is in Wisconsin. The public understanding of gerrymandering wasn't as great as it is now. And the organizing wasn't as great either. Now, in 56 of our 72 counties, the citizens have voted by referendum or resolution that they are urging the legislature to ban gerrymandering. They're not 56 blue counties out there. They're not 46 blue counties. They're not 36 blue counties out there. They're not 26 blue counties. So this is something that crosses ideological lines. And these referendums and resolutions passed by overwhelming numbers. And so the people are with us on this issue of gerrymandering. That's also reflected in a Marquette Law School poll, which showed 72% of Wisconsinites want to ban gerrymandering, including 66% of Republicans. So I think on the level of public education, we're winning. We haven't won in the courts. Remember the 2011 gerrymander, which is one of the worst gerrymanders in modern American history, went to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court punted and sent it back down to the federal court. The federal court had ruled the maps unconstitutional when it first got to the federal court. Ruled the partisan gerrymandering was unconstitutional, depriving Democrats of their First Amendment rights of association and speech and their 14th Amendment rights of equal protection. The U.S. Supreme Court heard the case, sent it back to the federal court in Madison, and I was at the federal court when the first trial went on. And the U.S. Supreme Court said there was a problem of standing. People who brought the lawsuit couldn't show individualized harm by the gerrymandered maps. So they said, go back to the federal court and come back with better plaintiffs here who can show personalized harm. And they did that. But before the federal district panel of judges could hear the case again, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on 2 different gerrymandering cases. And it gave the U.S. Supreme Court the perfect opportunity to ban hyperpartisan gerrymandering. One of those cases was from Maryland, where Democrats had rigged the maps, and one of those cases was from North Carolina, where Republicans in North Carolina had rigged the maps. And rigging the maps, gerrymandering, let me be clear, is absolutely wrong, whether it's Democrats rigging the maps in New York and Maryland, whether it's Republicans rigging the maps in North Carolina and Wisconsin. So what did the U.S. Supreme Court do? Well, it was split 5-4. And Chief Justice Roberts was the decisive vote. And he said, on the one hand, hyperpartisan gerrymandering is, this is a direct quote, incompatible with our democratic principles. And then he said, in his next breath, this is not a direct quote, go away, don't ever come back, we don't want to hear from you ever again, don't even try to knock on a federal courthouse door with your hyperpartisan gerrymandering cases, because we don't want to deal with it. Because we don't know how to measure it, we don't want to deal with it, leave it to the states. And of course, when the U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice finds something to be incompatible with their democratic principles, I would think he would have an obligation to rectify that problem and redress that injustice, but no, he didn't. He sent it back to the states, which created a tremendous catch-22 or chicken and egg problem, because if you're sending back to a state that has already gerrymandered the maps, like here in Wisconsin, and the party that gerrymandered the maps is still in control, how are you possibly going to fix that problem? So that's kind of where we stood when the new maps got gerrymandered. And I was there, and some of you may have been there, in the Capitol in Madison when Robin Voss was unveiling his newly gerrymandered maps. And there were about 200 of us in the hallway and in the room who had signed those little slips and said, we want to testify against these rigged maps, because they were even worse rigged than they were in 2011. And only 2 people testified in favor of the maps. You know who those 2 people were? Robin Voss and Devin Lemming, 2 leaders of the Republican Party in the legislature. They couldn't find a single citizen to get off their tail and come to that room and testify in favor of these rigged maps. And so I was there when Robin Voss was testifying. At first, he did his usual BS. Republicans win not because of the maps or gerrymandering, because we got better candidates. Or the Republicans win because, you know, all you Democrats are just cram yourselves into Milwaukee County and Dane County and leaving the rest of the counties for us. So why are you complaining? Move out of Milwaukee County or move out of Dane County. I don't think he said that, but that was the implication. So, but then he coughed up a confession. And I was sitting right there, just a few rows away, where he said, yes, we did use partisanship when we were drawing the maps. Well, by that he meant he looked at how Republicans were voting and Democrats were voting in this district, that district, and the other district. And they used that data to cram as many Democrats into as few districts as possible. So the remaining districts would be overwhelmingly Republican. I mean, that was confessing to a crime. It was not a crime here in Wisconsin yet, but it may be a crime in the year ahead. Because what gives me hope on the gerrymandering issue is we have a pivotal election in April here for the Wisconsin Supreme Court, because one of the conservative justices, and remember the court is split 4-3 with conservatives in the majority by one vote, Pat Rogan-Sack is retired. She's retiring, and then so it'll be 3-3, and whoever wins in April, whatever the ideology of the candidate who wins in April will decide the ideology of the court. And it's conceivable to me if a pro-democracy justice is elected, a justice who understands that gerrymandering is a violation of our rights and a violation of the Wisconsin Constitution, that the will of the people is not the law of the land, that we're not getting fair representation in Wisconsin, that a lawsuit can come back to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and that the Wisconsin Supreme Court will rule the current maps as unconstitutional, and then new maps will have to be drawn before 2030. We don't have to wait for 2030. So that's a possibility. And I do hope folks will turn out and vote in April. It's really important.
I have a question about the topic you just said. There are 3 candidates that I'm aware of, the Republican, Kelly.
Dan Kelly used to be on the bench.
And then Mitchell, and a woman whose name.
Judge Janet.
I can't think her.
Judge Janet. Yeah.
Right. Now, what I'm afraid of is going to happen is that 2 women are going to split the vote and the Kelly is going to win.
Well, there'll be a runoff. So there's going to be a primary. You know, the biggest joke in Wisconsin politics is that races for Supreme Court are nonpartisan. They're not nonpartisan. Maybe they should be. Ideally, they should be. In the last 20 years, you know, they haven't been, and for the foreseeable future, they are partisan battles. So what we have going on in February is, at least at the moment, there are 2 liberal judges running. Judge Janet, right? And Everett Mitchell from Dane County. And then Dan Kelly, the former defeated justice, who's a conservative. And now there's rumor that the judge who was presiding over this, the guy who plowed into the parade, that she may throw her hat in the ring and run. And then you'd have 2 conservatives and 2 liberals running. But whatever, no matter how many candidates are running in February, there'll be a runoff in April.
We have a get out the vote group here at the UUs. Do you have any suggestions for getting out the vote for the an election like the Supreme Court, which so many few people actually vote for?
Yeah, I would work with the League of Women Voters and also contact the Wisconsin Fair Maps Coalition, or contact me, Carlene Betchen, who works with me and is the great statewide grassroots organizer for the Wisconsin Fair Maps Coalition. We're trying to come up with messaging over the next couple of weeks that'll be most effective in getting voter turnout in a 501c3 nonpartisan way to get people out in February, but especially in April. Yes.
I really appreciate your messages of hope. I needed to hear that.
Thank you.
However, the last couple of days in my social media feed, I've seen conversation building about the possibility of our newly elected legislature talking and the talk about impeaching our governor and impeaching our Supreme Court judges that they don't agree with. How real do you think that is?
Well, I read the same article that you did, I imagine. I don't know. I mean, my initial tendency is to say that might be too far, but every time I tell myself it's too far, they go too far. And so there's nothing that would totally surprise me. But I don't think the governor is at risk of being, for him to be impeached, you need a vote by the assembly and then 2/3 of the Senate. Of course, Republicans have 2/3 of the Senate now. But, you know, I still think there are a couple decent people left in the Republican Senate, including Rob Coles up in the Green Bay area. And I'd be hard pressed to believe that he'd go along with just a crass, we've got the power, we don't care what you do, we're gonna impeach you and throw you out. I don't think that, I wouldn't think that's the likeliest outcome to happen. It did get on my radar though, when I read that article, that's for sure. I'll go to you in a second right here.
So what is, or is there anything we can do about a legislature that gavels out in February and doesn't allow any legislation to be worked on for the entire year?
Well, it is good work if you can get it, isn't it? I just think there's nothing you can do immediately except raise your voice and send them letters and send them emails and, you know, support candidates that aren't doing that, that are running against them. And I just think it's atrocious the way they dealt with these issues that the governor was trying to bring to the center. The most recent was on the abortion issue, and also the greater issue, or the issue above the abortion issue, just as far as procedure goes, is whether we should have the right as citizens in Wisconsin to have binding referendums. Michigan has binding referendums. That's how they banned gerrymandering. A young activist was appalled by the gerrymander and got on Facebook and other social media and said, who wants to sign this petition to ban gerrymandering? And she got tens of thousands of people. They got it on the bill, they threw it out. Ohio has binding referendums. That's how they got rid of their own Act 10. I remember Governor Kasich was there. A lot of people like him as Republican, but he's anti-labor as Walker was. And they passed a bill in Ohio shortly after Act 10 passed here. And the union movement in Ohio was appalled by it. They got it on referendum. They threw it on a referendum. And we should have binding referendums here in Wisconsin. It's an oddity that we don't. I say it's an oddity because we are, you know, fighting Bob LaFollette, progressive tradition. In the early part of the 20th century, we led the country in progressive area reforms. We weren't able to get binding referendums done, unfortunately. And I think we should have them.
And there are a couple very informative essays in the New York Times yesterday about the youth vote this month and how it was the biggest turnout in 30 years of young people. What were your numbers for Wisconsin along those lines, and how much did the youth vote matter?
Yeah, I think the youth vote mattered a lot. I don't have specific numbers, but a lot of young people on campuses were voting. I saw a figure like 70% of young people who turned out voted Democratic, so it was a very smart organizing by the Democrats. And you know, if I'm Mandela Barnes, I'm 26,000 short. I'm just wondering, maybe, God, if we had spent more time on the campuses or more time in Dane County and Milwaukee County and a couple of the other counties, or maybe if we ran better ads. You know, that's the problem with close election. Just start thinking of all the things you could have done different. Yeah.
In regards to the fake electors, I continue to be amazed at one, that it happened, and two, it seems that they just can't do anything about it. What Josh Call said that he went through the statutes and he's not finding anything that he could work with. You think that's legitimate? And also, I was wondering if there's such thing as him putting together a case and referring it to the State Department, considering it is a national election.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the question, because the false electors is just absolutely appalling to me that these folks perpetrated a fraud against the people of Wisconsin, wanted to disenfranchise the majority that voted, and that they're going to get away with it. I can't believe that Josh Call cannot find a statute under the fraud statute or some other statute that would allow him to prosecute. The great progressive law firm, this is another reason for hope. We've got a great progressive statewide law firm called Law Forward that is doing some incredible legal work in this state right now. And they sent a letter to, first I think it was to Josh Call, urging him to prosecute. Then they sent a letter to Ish Ozan, the DA in Dane County, because that's where the crime occurred. So Ish could bring a lawsuit too. And of course, as you're suggesting, Josh Paul could send it to Washington, send it to Justice Department, send it to Merrick Garland or to this Jack Smith guy who just appointed yesterday or the day before, and say, you know, go after these false electors. And I did read in the New York Times that this special counsel is looking at the false electors too. And I just don't think these folks should be able to get away with it. I mean, really, you can go just pretend that you're someone and you mail it. And maybe there's something in some of the, you know, the mail fraud things. They mailed it to Washington, for God's sakes. So anyway, I'm not a lawyer, but I would think that there is plenty of grounds for certainly an investigation that Josh Paul could lead. And I think he was timid before the elections and didn't want to get super partisan before the elections. But I'm hoping that he will now take this really seriously and take a look at it.
Were the names ever made, or do we know?
Sure, we know the names, and you could Google Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, Matt Rothschild and false electors, and you'll probably find something where I wrote a letter and listed their names. Otherwise, you could go to Law Forward, false electors, and find their names. One was the former head of the Republican Party of Wisconsin, Andrew Hitt, and the other one was Bob Spindell, Robert Spindell, who's still, if you can believe it, on the Wisconsin Elections Commission. That was 2 of the 10.
Yeah, well, Law Forward does have a lawsuit against, about these electors themselves.
They have a civil lawsuit against the electors.
Yeah, and by the way, we are having a forum, be an attorney from Law Forward that will be presenting in the spring session, so please keep that in mind and show up at that forum, so.
Yeah, Law Forward's doing just incredible work for us all. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming, for listening to me, for your great questions.